This is part 2 of the introductory lecture to the cardiovascular system. So I've already spoken a little bit about that introduction and about the basic anatomy of the heart. It'll make much more sense if you watch that part 1 if you haven't already. This little section is going to focus on blood vessels. I'm going to start again by giving you the basic anatomy of blood vessels here. So all blood vessels follow the same basic anatomy in that they are tubes, and through the tubes they contain a lumen. So that's what we describe as the inside of any blood vessel, be it an artery, a vein, or a capillary. And again, a common feature in every single type of blood vessel is that that lumen is lined with a single layer of endothelial cells. So again, the arteries have a layer of endothelial cells, the veins have a layer of endothelial cells, and the capillaries are tubes formed almost entirely from a single layer of endothelial cells. So already we're beginning to see the differences in structure here as well, but they're the things that are in common between all of them. Again, all blood vessels will also have this tunica intima, apart from capillaries, which have a tunica externa. Now, this tunica intima is a layer of connective tissue that separates the endothelial cells from the muscle cell layer. Now, in the cardiovascular system, we have smooth muscle cells. So hopefully you'll be able to see what I mean here. So we have the endothelial cells. Imagine this is the tube, my hands are the tube. If you go through the tube is lined with endothelial cells, and then around that, orientated in the opposite direction, are smooth muscle cells. And as they contract, the tube will narrow. So again, arteries and veins both have this smooth muscle cell layer. Now, what you want to understand, the major difference between the arteries and the veins is that the arteries tend to have thicker walls compared to veins, whereas veins have thinner, more elastic walls, but do contain that smooth muscle cell layer. The other thing to note is that much more of the blood volume, most of your blood is in your veins at any one point, and veins have a much larger and a much more distendable and can store more blood than either arteries or the capillary vessels. Now, around the outside of veins and arteries, we also have the tunica adventitia, represented by the grey here and the grey here. Now, this contains fat cells, often connective tissue as well. In larger blood vessels may contain small blood vessels that supply the muscle layers, and also contain the nervous signals which connect to blood vessels. So there's neurons or nerve endings that affect blood vessels as well. So moving on to the nerves that are supplying the blood vessels, and here I'm going to mainly focus on arteries. Now, arteries, arterioles and veins do have nervous input, and this is mainly from the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system releasing noradrenaline onto the blood vessels. And this structure here is showing you an example of a sympathetic nerve along a blood vessel. And in this case, it is an artery, and you can see that this actually penetrates through the smooth muscle cell there as well. The noradrenaline released acts on alpha-1 adrenal receptors, which constrict blood vessels. The main thing to remember is that sympathetic nerves release noradrenaline and constrict blood vessels. Now, it's important that I've mentioned noradrenaline because that's the neurotransmitter released from the sympathetic nerves. It is also worth bearing in mind that you also have circulating adrenaline, which also constricts most blood vessels, but does dilate some blood vessels, including those supplying the heart, the lungs, and the skeletal muscle. And I'll go into more detail in next year, but you should also look to Professor Stevens' lectures where the roles of noradrenaline and adrenaline are talked about. So we've already mentioned there's different types of blood vessels. We've got the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. And it's important to remember that it's the arteries that control the blood pressure. Now, the arteries are at high pressure and also have a high blood velocity. And what we're showing here is the pressure within the cardiovascular system. And what happens as we enter the arterial system, we'll see that the pressure is very high in the arterial system, particularly in the large arteries. And we can see that the velocity is also high in these large arteries. Now, as we go down the cardiovascular tree and we go to the capillary bed, which is represented by these brackets here, this is the capillaries are the site of fluid and solute transfer. So we can see when we're in the capillaries that as well as being low pressure, there is also a low velocity, but a huge increase in the surface area that's available. So they're small, thin, and have a large surface area to allow that solute exchange. And again, when we think about the veins, we're thinking about return blood to the heart. Again, the veins are at low pressure at the highest in the arterial system, and pressure drops across the arterial system, across the vascular system until it returns to the heart. Again, we can see that they have, as the blood returns towards the heart, the velocity begins to pick up and the surface area begins to drop again. But it's very important to remember that the veins hold the largest volume of the blood at low pressure, and that's why they're elastic and they distend. And we'll come back to that in lecture 3. So if we look at arteries, we have large arteries that are what we call elastic arteries, which would include arteries like the aorta, and to some extent other large arteries or other large muscular arteries, such as the brachial artery as well. And they're a little bit more elastic, and those larger arteries are a bit more elastic because they have to dampen down those pressure waves caused by the heartbeat. When we're getting into the muscular arteries, which have less elastin, that also includes the resistance arteries, such as the small resistance arteries, and they're typically very small in size, less than 300 microns in size. Now, if you want to get an idea about how small these arteries are, If you were to pluck out one of your hairs from your head and look at it, then your hair is probably about 50 microns, 50 micrometers in diameter. So just a little bit thicker than a hair. So really, really quite small. They're the ones that are called resistance arteries because they control blood pressure, because it's across this area where we get the largest drop in blood pressure, and therefore the most control over the blood pressure. And again, that's something I'll come back to. Then finally, we have the very smallest arteries, which we call arterioles. And these are about the thickness of a human hair, very small, round about 60 microns, normally only a couple of layers of smooth muscle cell. And they're the arteries that actually control perfusion into the capillary beds. And finally, we have the veins. Now, venules are the smallest veins, and they return the blood back to the main venous system. The larger veins are where we hold the largest volumes of blood. As we've already mentioned, these veins are at low pressure, and they have, because they're at low pressure, if you imagine the veins in your lower leg, how they have to return that blood back to the heart against the force of gravity, but they're at low pressure. So veins have a valve system which helps to maintain the direction of flow. And these valves require muscle action from the muscles within your legs to return the blood to your heart. So you can see if the muscles in your lower limbs are closed, then the blood is stored within a segment of the vein and would remain stored in that segment until the muscles are contracted, and those muscles contracting forces the valves in the veins to open, and the blood can flow to the next segment, and that helps to return the blood to the heart and prevents backflow of blood. And if you want to see how this is done, many of us have protruding veins on our hands. It'll be a bit difficult to see in this video. The veins on my hands are not that protruding, but you can quite easily put your finger over one of those veins and then move the upper finger away, and you'll see if you keep that first finger there, the blood does not return. It doesn't backfill because the blood in the veins further up doesn't return back into that vein because the valves are closed. It's only in the direction of blood flow when I release the other finger that the blood returns into that vein. Similarly, if you do the same again and you've drained the blood from the vein and release the bottom finger, you'll see that it instantly refills the vein because the valves allow the blood to flow in that direction and fill the vein. So that's something you can try, and I'll try and post a YouTube video link on how that is done. And of course, without that valves and return of blood, you would faint because all the blood would pool in your body. And often in military processions where troops have to stand to attention, often troops can faint because they're standing for long periods of time, standing very still, and the blood is not returning to their heart and to their upper lungs, and that can be a reason why you faint. It just illustrates why one must, if standing for long periods of time, which pharmacists probably have to do, why you have to make sure that you keep your muscles active. Now I'm going to end this little section just talk about something that I think is important to note. I've spoken about in part 1 cardiac muscle, and here I've spoken about vascular smooth muscle. And I want you to know that cardiac and smooth muscle are very different to the skeletal muscle that is mentioned in Professor Stevens' lectures. And the reasons for the differences can be found in Professor Stevens' lectures. I just want to re-highlight it there. In your skeletal muscle, you have calcium-dependent contraction and the muscle is very striated. In the cardiac muscle, again, it's calcium-dependent constriction, but it's only found in the heart. And you'll notice that the structure is slightly less organized than that for rigid or of the skeletal muscle. The smooth muscle, on the other hand, that I've been talking about here is very different indeed. The muscle cells are separate, they're smooth in appearance, hence the name smooth muscle. They do not have striations. And while calcium is an important step in their constriction, it's phosphorylation dependent constriction. And smooth muscle is found in the cardiovascular system in the vasculature, but it's also worth remembering that smooth muscle also occurs in the gastrointestinal tract and also in the lungs as well. I think it's really important to read Pocock and Richard's Human Physiology to understand this in a little bit more detail that I will not cover in these lectures. So I'm going to end this part here and come back to you in part 3 where I'll talk about the microvasculature.